My name is Elle Green, and I'm a junior at Roosevelt, and thank you for coming to my GTLS presentation. For this semester of GTLS, I wanted to dive into the true histories and beliefs of leaders in the civil rights movement and Black Power movements. I researched a very wide range of folks and ultimately landed on the problems brought out by the common belief in a rigid dichotomy between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X's beliefs and tactics as activists. Typically for GTLS, we choose a catalyst course to start our studies, but I really had a catalyst book called The Radical King, edited and introduced by Cornel West, containing a collection of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s essays, sermons, and speeches. Now I'm going to present you with some excerpts from various speeches from the two men, and in the chat, I'd like you to put the man's name who you think the excerpt is from. First, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly asks, I agree with the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. I'll give you a few seconds to put it in the chat if you'd like to. This is from Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Second, if violence is wrong in America, violence is wrong abroad. If it is wrong to be violent defending Black women and Black children and Black babies and Black men, then it is wrong for America to draft us and make us violent abroad in defense of her. I'll give you a moment to put in the chat if you'd like. So this is from Malcolm X in '63 at a speech in New York City. Third, Africa does have spectacular savages and brutes today, but they are not Black. They are the sophisticated white rulers of South Africa who profess to be cultured, religious, and civilized, but whose conduct and philosophy stamp them unmistakably as modern-day barbarians. I'll give you a second to put it in the chat if you'd like. This is from Dr. Martin Luther King's Let My People Go speech on Human Rights Day in December of '65. Fourth, and finally, the curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. I'll give you a second. This is from Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? This activity is just to get you thinking about what you know and believe these men to stand for and hopefully challenge that idea. The Malcolm myth and the King myth, as called by Gerald Horne for the Oxford University Press, are ones we can all describe. Malcolm X is seen as anti-white, violent, criminal, and ineffective at creating change. And as Kevin Brun-Yale for the Indiana University Press describes, the predominant view of Dr. King constructs him as haloed, a consensual figure deployed to endorse the idea that the United States is now in a post-racial era in which neoliberal governing priorities reign supreme. This leads me to my thesis. The American public has a harmful one-dimensional view of MLK and Malcolm X that represents larger problems of understanding history and racism in America that must be rectified if this nation is to move towards racial equity and justice. While I am going to talk about these men's similarities, the title of my presentation was a hook more than anything. I must also acknowledge that these men were indeed different, but they were not polar opposites, nor are they different in the way that popular opinion holds. Malcolm X was not a violent, evil man, and Dr. King was not accepted and loved by white America. The most major difference between the two in terms of ideology is major because of how threatening it is to white folks and their maintaining of power in America. Dr. Martin Luther King, in the earlier days of his activism, focused on appealing to white folks. He was more of a political activist in his earlier days, and white folks were in charge of politics. He sought to try to change their perception of Black folks. He sought to demonstrate that Black folks are not violent, are not criminals, and are not to cause harm, and deeply feared that anything other than rigid nonviolence would convince white folks otherwise. He would argue extensively with fellow organizers to prevent them from taking up arms to defend themselves, especially in the Deep South, where they were not only up against unchecked police brutality, but also Klan threats of violence. The Southern Poverty Law Center names 40 civil rights martyrs that were killed, obviously including Dr. King. Hundreds more were injured and dealt with extreme trauma as a result of their experiences. Accounts from Martin himself describe the extreme violence that Black folks endured to prove they were worthy of desegregating for. It is important to recognize that this is not the only reason that desegregation saw any success. It was successful because of mass boycotts that provided economic incentive and mass activism promoting the little political change that occurred. Further, this endured violence did not even result in any sustained attention on the problems that led to the violence, like the policing institution. My point is that this aspect of MLK's activism can also be considered to Black folks' detriment, rather than the sole reason to praise him. And reflecting on these conditions and applying them to broader discussions of race in America, we might consider trying to stop fixating on telling Black folks to remain nonviolent when their lives are at risk over a clearly evil cause, rather than criticizing violent officers, politicians, and institutions who might force folks into violence in order to survive. This then leads to the difference in audience that Malcolm was speaking and acting for, Black folks. As more of a cultural activist, he encouraged his audiences to have Black pride and promoted the idea that Black folks should have control over their economy and their community under the ideology of Black nationalism. He would bluntly call out white supremacy and say some pretty inflammatory things that the media quickly latched onto. He had little faith in the American political system, especially shown in his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. So he was worried less than Dr. King about appealing to white audiences. He found it rather pointless to try to convince white folks that Black people were suffering under Jim Crow, and found it much more effective to instill pride and educate Black communities on how to survive this white supremacy. Returning to the Ballot or Bullet speech he delivered, he did in fact proclaim that folks should protect their rights by any means necessary, which people today often fixate on about Malcolm X. What is important to recognize about this proclamation is that the political barriers he was observing seemed quite obsolete. It is not as if he was uninformed about the political happenings surrounding the various civil rights and Black liberation groups' work. He explains his observations and detailed insights in many of his writings and speeches. He just simply opposed Martin's approach of encouraging Black folks to continue to suffer and die in order to possibly convince political forces to protect them in just one area of the expansive systemic racism in this country. He was himself not engaged in any violence during his time as an activist. He merely threatened it as an inevitable consequence of America ignoring the cries of its Black citizens. These different approaches have proven to be differently threatening to white folks and white supremacy over time, leading to the formulation of one-dimensional, binary good and evil perceptions of these men and their work. They have very different backgrounds. Martin grew up as middle-class Black preacher's son in the South, while Malcolm grew up dirt poor in the North and served time in prison after being orphaned. Their subsequent faith in the conditions for Black folks was quite different, which informed their beliefs, but both men grew and evolved as their activism continued. They did also have many similarities in their beliefs, especially as it pertained to global consciousness and liberation. Dr. King was strongly opposed to colonialism and the US's involvement in young countries while they came out of colonialism, referring to the Cold War involvement. He was strongly opposed to apartheid in South Africa and bitterly criticized the United States' hypocrisy in neglecting to rescind their economic aid to the nation and its role in perpetuating racist exploitation. Further, he spoke on neocolonialism in Latin America through US corporations. He wanted the citizens and authorities in the US to recognize that their riches were endowed by the chance placement of natural resources and that other, now deemed underdeveloped nations had those resources extracted from them by other nations. Later in his career, he became more involved with the discussion around human rights and came to significantly impact international law, his work inspiring the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in '65. Malcolm also had a global understanding of the struggle for liberation. In fact, he advocated for and hoped to take the case of Black oppression to the UN to achieve sanctions on the US for violating Black folks' human rights, like William Patterson, Paul Robeson, and W.E.B. Du Bois of the Civil Rights Congress in 1951. Malcolm frequently spoke out about the US government's involvement in assassination of foreign leaders like Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese prime minister, which Dr. King also spoke on in less direct terms. Typical. He spent many months in Africa and the Middle East, stopping over in France and England to enhance the relationship between African Americans and the African diaspora in Western Europe. He recognized, like Dr. King's famous quote from the letter from Birmingham jail, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," and that the global oppressed must stand together. Both were also very compelled to fight poverty and saw it as one of the greater evils in the world. Firstly, Malcolm X's solution to poverty was Black nationalism. He did not find dignity or purpose in Black folks trying to force their way into white business where they were clearly not wanted. Quote, "The economic philosophy of Black nationalism only means that we have to become involved in a program of re-education, to educate our people into the importance of knowing that when you spend your dollar out of the community in which you live, the community in which you spend your money becomes richer and richer. The community out of which you take your money becomes poorer and poorer," unquote. With Black spending power of $20 billion per year in the 1960s, he reasoned that his fellow leaders should have been teaching them how to pool their wealth together to set up something of their own. After they set up something of their own, they would no longer have to beg for the white man's job. The legacy of this belief extends into today, with the calls for many activists to support Black business. Clearly, it resonated and made plenty of sense to folks, but the term Black nationalism to describe it was seemingly too assertive for white America to handle. This challenges how folks view Malcolm X, because many villainize Black nationalism. But is this not the same ideologies that many people support in today's movements? And is it not simply important advice for uplifting one's community in a society dominated by large corporations? Martin was also a strong opponent to poverty, something many folks don't know about him. He joined Malcolm in his understanding and activism around Black folks being unwanted in white economic affairs. Thus, he created Operation Breadbasket in Atlanta and Chicago in 1962. He proclaimed, quote, "Many retail businesses and consumer goods industry deplete the ghetto by selling to Negroes without returning to the community any of the profits through fair hiring practices," unquote. The group gathered employment statistics for industries selling their products in Black communities, and if these statistics demonstrated that Black folks were underemployed or restricted to menial positions, ministers from Operation Breadbasket asked the company to negotiate a more equitable employment practice. If they refused, the group encouraged boycotts of businesses and products. By 1967, Atlanta's Breadbasket had negotiated jobs bringing a total of $25 million a year in new income to the Black community. Chicago Breadbasket went on to target Pepsi and Coca-Cola bottlers and then supermarket chains, winning 2,000 new jobs worth $15 million a year in new income to the Black community in the first 15 months of its operation. Going beyond jobs and patronage for Black-owned businesses, Chicago-based Operation Breadbasket became a cultural event focused around weekly Saturday workshops, which drew thousands to hear Jackson preach in person on the radio. He has various speeches where he calls on the United States to fix the widening wealth gaps we see desperately getting worse today. This problem of poverty, Dr. King says, is not only seen in the class division between the highly developed industrial nations and the so-called underdeveloped nations. It is seen in great economic gaps within the rich nations themselves. Within the United States, he criticized the government's action, even President Johnson's war on poverty, for focusing on the symptoms of poverty rather than the root. He supported a universal basic income, hoping it would allow for fair housing for all people and allowing them to invest back in their communities, laying out the case for the guaranteed income in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He started the Poor People's Campaign in partnership with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples in 1967. He was assassinated while planning for this march was taking place. The goal was to erect a tent city on the National Mall that would dramatize the reality of joblessness and deprivation at the doorstep of the nation's leaders. Their similarities in quest to unify the global struggle for liberation and battle for poverty against poverty in a truly radical and brave way can help us understand how both of these men's activism has been manipulated. We, in our collective memory, have done both of these men a disservice by limiting them to a binary good and evil, violent and nonviolent status. Malcolm X and Dr. King were both significantly dynamic activists that will never be accurately portrayed by the American public that still suffers from racism and oppression. It is important that we remember that this country is still the same country who vehemently opposed desegregation and allowed Black folks to get brutalized in their battle against it. It is important that folks reject any notions and examples of these activists that function to portray America as existing post-racially and cherry pick from these men's activism and speeches to defend ideas that neither man would have stood for. In summary, I would conclude that Dr. King was sanitized and made palatable and praised, but not given true study and attention. Malcolm X was villainized and misconstrued to divert from his factual analysis and empowerment of Black folks. It would be wonderful if they could have worked together, as they had planned to on February 24th, 1965, had Malcolm X not been taken from this earth. I hope you leave my presentation understanding that the American public has a harmful one-dimensional view of MLK and Malcolm X that represents larger problems of understanding history and racism in America that must be rectified if this nation is to move towards racial equity and justice. Thank you so much for your time and energy today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Okay, if you guys have any questions.
I meant to clap. I meant to clap, but I hit my hand up. But I could ask a question. You choose.
I'll
wait for other people. Oh, there's people. There you go. Do you want? Should they raise their hand or type?
Either one works.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
Can I go?
Mm-hmm.
Congrats, very good. How do you think, I completely agree with you that at the time that both men were living, that was the standard view. There's been a lot of scholarship lately, and so how do you, what do you think of today's scholarship? You know, there's been a lot of biographies of Malcolm and Martin, and certainly public figures haven't evolved history evolves. You know, we all think very differently of lots of famous people than we did at the time that they were. So, so what do you think of current scholarship? Like, I'm thinking of a bio I just read of Malcolm, The Dead Are Rising, that was really interesting, talking about the myth making of his early years, you know, that he did and stuff. So I'm interested in your point of view of that. So.
Right. So I have not read a ton of recent scholarship about it other than articles. Like, I haven't been able to read a lot of books because I'm super busy with school. But I have read a lot of criticism about how, you know, like, people still don't accurately portray them. But yeah, I definitely think people are evolving, but that is definitely among the scholarly community. I don't think the broader American public has gotten there yet. And I don't think a lot of politicians have gotten there yet.
So what was the most surprising thing you learned about both of the men during your research? And then I'll stop asking questions.
For Dr. King, I didn't know anything about his war on poverty efforts, like nothing at all. I'd never heard about any of that. And also that I didn't get to mention in my presentation that he was very against materialism and the military-industrial complex. He spoke out extensively on that. I had no idea because I had really only heard his I Have a Dream speech in school.
Sure.
And then for Malcolm X, I didn't know anything about him really before I did this project. And I did not know what Black nationalism was. I thought it was the same as white nationalism. And that's probably why I was so moved by the fact that he's just asking for independence.
Sure.
Thank you for your questions.
Of course.
Does anyone
You have
else?
so many people. I think you have other people with their hands up too.
Oh, okay. I just see Miss McConaughey. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I can. So both men really had different leadership styles, as you pointed out. Which one do you think was probably the most effective?
I think that both of them were really important and that both approaches make a lot of sense. I think it's really hard to say which was more effective because, I mean, both of them got killed for, I mean, maybe Malcolm X was killed for his activism, but I don't know. I think that's really hard to say. Obviously, Dr. King had more of a political influence and Malcolm X had more of a cultural influence because he ended up kind of giving the Black Panthers and the group before the Black Panthers, the Revolutionary Action Movement, part of their ideology, this idea of self-determination. So thank you for your question. Miss Dunley, do you have a question?
I do. And here's the deal. Your voice isn't frozen, but your face is. So I don't know if you want to, you don't necessarily have to stay on the screen. You could put a slide up if you want, if that's bugging you, but it's not bugging me. I just thought I'd tell you. I know Kelly put it in the chat that it is too. And anyway, let me ask this question. And I know that you've gone over this in your blog and stuff. Where would you like to see this more authentic, realistic covering of both of these men in the curriculum in DMPS? Like, where would you like to see it embedded and grade level, and how do you want to see them embedded?
Is my camera working again?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. I definitely think that it would be interesting to read their speeches in English class because both of them are really amazing writers but have very different styles. And I think it would be really interesting to rhetorically analyze them, but also, of course, study them more accurately in history classes, especially on Dr. King Day, when a lot of teachers talk about Dr. King. I would love it if they would have a more holistic presentation of him and probably mention some of his anti-poverty efforts, because that's so critical right now. And I also think that they could be implemented into, I mean, obviously we don't have a philosophy class, but either of them would be super interesting to study, especially Malcolm X's theories. His political theories and observations are extremely compelling. I think there's a lot of options for people to put it into their curriculum, and I think it would be really beneficial to students of color.
I have a follow-up then. I have
Okay.
a follow-up. Okay, so then it's sort of like with Ezra's too. What training do you think needs to be done before the teachers try to embed that? I think we can't, you know what I mean? We can't give a directive if they're part of the people who believe one of these men is evil and one of these people is all good, right? So what kind of training more, or one book that you think, I know that's narrowing it down, but what do you think they need?
Honestly, I am not sure, because that's what we're working on in a racial equity and justice team right now, that PD, to make sure that, you know, it's not problematic discussions that are harmful to students of color. I'm not really sure, but I do think reading a book on white fragility first would be really important, so that it's not focused on trying to show that like they're like a good white person or something like that when they talk about it, and that it's truly geared toward uplifting Black students. How to be anti-racist. I have not read that.
Yeah, it's by Ibram Kendi, and so I'd recommend that one. So, because it's palatable in terms of length, so it would just be a nice piece to that perhaps everybody could read. But I mean, there's certainly a lot of things that can be read. So.
Those are great recommendations. Sorry, I didn't have.
I put an easy one in there. I mean, for in case not easy, you know what I mean? Like a nice, I think a starter book, let's say. But I forgot to put her the author's name. So sorry. And yes, I agree, Kelly. Ibram Kendi's book is great. But what was the Cornell West one that you said that I missed?
The Radical King. It's just a collection of his writings.
Oh, I like that. Okay, thank you. I'll stop talking because I know you have other hands raised.
Excuse me. Mo Marks.
Yeah, so do you think that the differences, like religiously, between the two men has any impact on the way that most people in the country view them?
That is a really good point. I think definitely it would, because Islam is so villainized here. Yeah, I did not look into that aspect, but that is a really interesting perspective.
Don't you think, particularly because Malcolm was an adherent of the Nation, which is its own really sort of its own bastardized version of Islam. I mean, if you read the history of some of its founders, like, so I mean, there was that kind of like, even though he ended up leaving it, you know, too many people associate it with that, right? So.
Yeah, I definitely think the inconsistencies and the many problems with the Nation of Islam reflected poorly on Malcolm X. But I mean, I think it is important to know too that he did leave and he did denounce it. So thank you for your question. Miss Davis.
was really curious about the learning process and, the research that you've done. You're taking this class this year and then looking forward to next year, perhaps taking this class again, but at the same time, you're going to have your AP research. So how will your learning this year impact your choices of what you're going to want to really dig into more next year?
That is a great question. How did you know I'm taking AP research? I don't know. There are so many issues that could pertain to this that I'm really interested in. I think it's really interesting to study how representation of Black leaders in schools affects outcomes for Black students in educational attainment. I looked at that a little bit for AP seminar this year, and I was really interested in Georgia Page's AP research project, which was talking about shifting from AP programming to honors programming and how that might help educational attainment for Black and Brown students.
I didn't mean to be like the creepiest creepster or anything. I just knew you're in AP seminar right now, so I assumed that was the next step.
I mean, if I pass the test, yes.
I feel good about it.
Thank you for your question. Do we have any more? Miss Dunley?
I don't know if I have a question. Okay, so you know how I always like to ask this. What would you like to do in the future with this work? Does it have any correlation to what you might want to study? Or does it have a correlation to your, or does it have a correlation to your activism? Or hey, another GTLS, I don't know,
Yeah, definitely correlated to what I might want to study in college. I love history. I think it is so interesting, especially understanding how our histories impact our current view of things and how it might have been misconstrued. That's basically the theme of all the research I did about all the Black leaders this semester. So I probably will study history in college, possibly with a focus on topics like these. I'm not totally sure. I'm interested in everything.
And you don't have to be sure, that's for sure.
Thank you for your question.
I'll start a book club with you, Elle. I'll recommend. So you have summer coming up, summer reading.
A lot more time. All right, are there any more questions?
You did a great job, Elle. Thanks so much. To the audience this morning, you got a email from me that has a reflection about, a feedback form for Elle that's in the email and attached. So whichever way it works best for you, if you could fill that out and send it back to Elle and I, both Elle and I, that would be excellent. And thank you so much for coming this morning.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Great job, Elle. I love it. I'm going to turn off our recording now.